Welcome to Bootstrapped, a Dingman Center podcast. I'm Ilana Fine.
And I'm Joe Bailey.
And as all our listeners know, each episode of Bootstrap features a funder or founder from the Dingman Center and University of Maryland community. Today, we are thrilled to welcome TERP alum and co-founder and president of EverFi. Sorry, take that back. Yes, sorry.
Yes.
Rewind. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Jon Chapman. Jon Chapman is a Smith alum and co-founder and president of global partnerships of EverFi. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, so just to kick things off a little bit, Jon, can you talk to us a little bit about your background, specifically in the education sector?
Sure. Yeah. So I really have spent my entire post-collegiate career in education in some form or the other. I had about 10 years of operating experience at Kaplan. Within the time I matriculated at Smith, I was, fortunate enough to get them to help support my tuition and getting my traditional MBA as part of kind of moving back here to the DC area in 2004. And then finished out my time there in 2007. And then at the beginning of 2008, as we just talked about, a little over 10 years ago, we started EverFi on January 17th, 2008. And, obviously been involved in EdTech since then. And we'll talk more about that today.
But I know we have a lot to cover, but I got to ask, 2008, that's an interesting time to be starting a company. There was a lot going on in the markets at that time.
It was interesting. In an odd way, though, it really kind of gave us some wind in our sails because the first content area we started to launch the company around was financial literacy. And even though it was a tumultuous time with the economy and the recession, there certainly was a spotlight on, a consumer's basic understanding of financial literacy, in particular where we were focusing, which was young adults in high school. So in that way, it was difficult from a capital markets perspective, and obviously getting the resources you needed we truly had to bootstrap our business, as is the name of this appropriate name of this podcast. But fortunately, we did that for the first few years, and the venture market started to kind of come around.
Can you tell exactly then how you bootstrapped them, and what kind of revenue are you generating from kind of day one?
Well, from day one, we really, I think, and this served us well. We very much focused on driving revenue. We wanted to create a technology company that wasn't necessarily on the traditional get a lot of users and then monetize it basis. We really wanted to create customers, create revenue. And so we created a model where we built our learning platform. We introduced it into schools, but we got somebody else to pay for it. And by paying for it and licensing it, they were private labeling it. And so once we had a first, MVP of our learning platform, we were quickly able to get some revenue and really work our way through those first 2 years before our first venture raise.
So EverFi is a well-known company here in the DC area, but for those who aren't familiar,
Still
can
crazy
you?
for me to hear that,
Right. So can you just step back a little bit, talk about what the original value proposition was when you launched, kind of what you saw in the market at that time?
Sure. So we are an education technology company at our core, but we're a very unique one. We saw a real need back in 2008 to create content around critical skills. And, that first critical skill area was financial literacy. We saw a need to teach that in the classroom using learning technology. There was more and more proliferation of using that type of technology by teachers. And at the same time, we saw a need for the private sector to get involved. Think about something like financial literacy. It's always been sort of the province of banks and credit unions and other financial institutions to support that type of learning, but it had been done sort of in a way that had been phoned in. There's been paper-based workbooks. A volunteer comes in for a day. Kids' heads hit the desk out of sheer boredom. And we said, we can reinvent this. We can really reimagine using technology, using gamification, using the latest and new media to teach kids about financial literacy in a way that they could understand it, and we could pass that credit along to those institutions.
So let's follow up, because in class we talk a lot about finding product market fit.
Yes.
So when you talk about financial literacy for kids, was this all kids in all classrooms, or were you going for a certain target market who maybe their parents weren't
Yeah,
weren't as financially
it was
literate or
very
some?
much a target market.
Okay.
It was high school age students, which is where most of the requirements in K-12 public schools were coming to teach this. So one of the other dynamics playing out here is you had a growing focus on core subject accountability. So No Child Left Behind kind of things around math and reading and English language arts. The skills like financial literacy were falling to the cutting room floor. And teachers were, wholly focused on those other areas. And so we were able to sort of use technology as a catalyst and an assistant to try to teach those topics again in a unique way. And so we focus on high school because that's where, we felt like was the most immediate fit. You had students going into the workforce and going into post-secondary, taking on student loans. They needed to have these skills under their belt. And so we really used that as a particular age group. We also went after communities of need. We went after the communities who needed us the most. We began the business across some of the poorest communities in the southeastern part of the U.S. We're talking about communities across rural Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. These were folks where we felt like they were kind of falling at the short end of the stick in terms of technological resources. A lot of urban centers and other kind of wealthier communities had these resources, but we wanted to make sure we provided those communities with the resources we were creating first. And so that was definitely a target market.
So you're targeting clearly the high school students to make sure that they have the financial literacy. There's a need for this, not only because they should have it, but also because of the way the curriculum is evolving. But where is the funding coming from?
So that's a great question, and that's really, I think, where we really stuck our landing. Those same communities I described are, kind of qualify as low to moderate income communities based on, obviously, the U.S. Census, but also based on a bank's business footprint. And we're here in Washington, D.C., where all regulations are made. And one of the oldest regulations in the banking industry is the Community Reinvestment Act obligations, where a bank has to execute on fair lending practices and fair business practices across their entire footprint, including low to moderate income parts of it. So they are required by law to provide education around not only to consumers trying to take out a mortgage if you're an adult, but also many times this type of investment into the youth in the community. So we found our funder in those banks who had CRA requirements.
So, and just because this is really important part of how your model works,
it's
and
a very important part. Yes.
To dig into that a little bit. So when you went out, so you were on one side of your two-sided market, which Joe loves. So it's, this is like an added bonus for you if you did. So you have the students that are your target that you're providing that service, but it sounds like a pretty real need for these banks to be able to say let me get the job done for you easy because you have this Community Reinvestment Act that, well, I'm sure they care a lot about it, often not the core part of their business and something that probably hangs over their head. And you're saying easy,
turnkey way for you to fulfill that regulatory requirement, do it in a reimagined and creative way that based on our value prop of our business, we private label that learning platform as yours. So one of our first customers, and still one of our biggest customers today, I'm so proud to say, is BB&T Bank, huge bank here in the Mid-Atlantic and across the southeastern U.S., obviously headquartered in North Carolina. We created
and great support of the Smith School. Thank you, BB&T.
Oh, good. Yes, they're fantastic. I give them all the plugs they can get. We created the BB&T Financial Foundation Scholars Program. It started with a single community center in Richmond, Virginia, where we drove $2,500 of real revenue, which at that time felt like $1 million. I literally remember sprinting down to the B of A here, where we just opened up our corporate account on Wisconsin Ave, which is right near our studio here today, and building that program for them there. And then that expanded expanded initially to about 100 schools in North Carolina, and then now today they're in 1,000 schools across their, I think, 10 or 11 state footprint. So it was certainly feeling a need for the financial institution as well as the students and the teachers in the schools.
But it seems like it was more than just sticking the landing. I mean, the level of difficulty of this is difficult because you've got to figure out how to be scalable from day one. So can you describe kind of scalability constraints?
Yeah, so those were real. I mean, we obviously technology is a good scaling accelerant, as we all know. And so, our ability to deploy this to a lot of schools quickly in a remote way was there. But one of the things we learned early on, and is stuck with us to our core today. And I think we've proven it out as a key part of our value proposition. Is we knew we needed, though, not to just be able to deploy through only our technology. We had to build a team of individuals that could build relationships locally with schools. So I started the business with two friends of mine from Bowdoin. So I went to Bowdoin for undergrad, obviously a proud Terp from my business school. And my first co-founder and I, we were together for the first year, and our third partner. So my first co-founder is Tom Davidson, by the way. Shout out to TD. And then our third partner was Ray Martinez, and we hired Ray specifically, or brought him on, I guess, as a partner, to be our first person who could go bring our technology to schools. And Ray really built the infrastructure of how we work with teachers today, and now we have almost 200 full-time employees that work all across the U.S. and Canada and deliver our technology into the classroom. And that's how we were able to scale. And it's not the traditional kind of super high margin, because these are full-time employees. This is an investment, but we wouldn't have the stickiness and the impact we've had today if we didn't have those folks.
So talk a little bit about what your product and service is. How how is it used, and how do students engage?
Sure. So today I'll start actually with K-12. I'll explain 3 segments really quickly, but we'll focus on K-12 because that's really the founding part of the business. So in K-12, today we still run our financial literacy curriculum. The learning platform, think of it as a highly engaging, gamified learning experience, probably anywhere from 10 to 15 hours of content that gets supplemented into an existing class.
Okay.
So, and typically in high school for financial literacy, stick with that example, we're in a lot of career and technical education classes. So teachers will use us, again, back to that first thought of teachers are really focused on core subjects. This becomes a nice, scalable, engaging supplement to teach these important skills in often required classes. And so we are delivering that during the school day. Our staff that I just mentioned before is working with those local educators. Again, when we present it out, it's private labeled as an initiative, as sort of a public-private sector initiative on behalf of a bank like BB&T or TCF Bank in the Twin Cities, or U.S. Bank or Mass Mutual as an insurance company that we work with all across the U.S. They're taking credit. When a student goes in, they're seeing it being brought to them by that organization. However, the curriculum itself is very neutral, meets all privacy requirements, has no marketing intention behind it, because we couldn't operate at the depth we do in schools if we had that. But again, goes back to that regulatory requirement for those financial institutions. That's a pain point we're meeting for them in the value proposition. Or increasingly, because we work with a lot of different organizations now today, it's also just a great community marketing kind of, that creates a nice halo effect around their brand. They're bringing this type of education technology into schools, into communities they care about. So providing that branding, we're providing that deployment into schools. We do a lot of events and earned media recognition to make sure that our private sector partners know that they're providing these types of educational technology resources to schools in K-12. So that's K-12. I can stop there now, and I can go into the other segments.
Yeah. So before we move on, because I think that there's got to be a value proposition beyond just kind of the regulatory need to do this. I mean, you're doing the private labeling. You're trying to build community awareness. I mean, talk about that and what your customers are saying about your service. Yeah,
so I think in many ways it has evolved. I mean, there's still that regulatory need, but it's evolved beyond that. As you talked about, Alana talked about the outsourced ability to meet these regulatory requirements. In many ways, we are also an outsourced resource for meeting marketing and awareness objectives as well. I'll use another pretty unique example, one that I'm really proud of, and one I spent a lot of my time on today, which combines a couple of passions of education and sports for me. So we actually run the community education programs for all 4 of the major pro sports leagues. And so the best example to that is our National Hockey League program. We run a program called Future Goals. So it's a different content area in K-12 than financial literacy. It's around science, technology, engineering, and math, and in particular the careers associated with those areas, using the game of hockey to inspire students to learn about those things.
Right.
And so, and that is, again, back to the private labeled initiative, is private labeled to all 31 NHL clubs. So a student here in the DC area is doing it as a Washington Capitals program. A student in Boston is doing it as a Bruins program, and so forth and so on.
And so how is that student accessing that accessing that content?
In much the same way as I described our financial literacy.
Okay.
In this case, it's just a middle school age target group.
Okay.
It's done through, in this case, actually, we're done through more traditional subjects. So we're typically working with more science and math teachers.
Okay, so it's still through the schools, but just with
schools.
the high. Okay,
Yep.
got it.
That's been our core bread and butter. It's always, we're up to now 20,000 K-12 schools across the U.S. and Canada. And we just, layer in different critical skills content, STEM careers, financial literacy, entrepreneurship, health and wellness. And, we take different private sector foundation-based partners and create private label programs for different size communities that they care about.
And when you say you're working with schools, are you working with kind of administrators that then push it down to, the school systems?
It's a good question. We take a combination approach the way I always like to describe it. So yes, top down through administrators. We meet with superintendents, curriculum directors, other administrators to try to get them excited about the vision of the resources we're providing. But then also really from the bottom up. So classroom to classroom, teacher to teacher, certainly school building to school building. Principals have a lot of influence over that directionally at a school building basis. So our full-time staff of implementation managers that I was alluding to before, they're building a blend of those relationships. So that's a combo.
Just as a follow-up then, when you look at kind of customer churn or stickiness is a term you mentioned earlier, are you finding that, once you have kind of all the different stakeholders kind of all on board with the product, that it's very unlikely they're going to leave?
From an educational perspective, we have good stickiness. However, we do have challenges because the reality of public schools is teacher turnover, administrator turnover, changing dynamics and requirements within a district. Obviously, we all know all the education in the U.S. is very local. It's a big reason why we made the decision to have those localized staff of almost 200 folks today, because there are changing environments that we always have to stay on top of. And we have to convince our partners who actually license our program that that's why we have to stay on top of it, because there is a level of just churn of teacher and administrator that we are managing each academic year. And our schools team does an absolutely fantastic job of managing that dynamic. And I'm proud to say our churn numbers are in good shape because of it. But it's not without its challenges.
So we see a lot of EdTech companies coming through the Dingman Center, presenting to our Dingman Center Angel Investor Network. And the number one concern our angels have is selling to K-12 and quite not creating the channels, the pipe that you have created. That's like probably the envy of every EdTech company behind you is that kind of following. What advice would you give to other companies? Obviously, no need to compete with you guys, but who are looking to to sell into in a variety of tools into K-12. What advice could you give without giving away your secret sauce? But what would be advice to sell into challenging?
I think for us, it's big. Based on our first decision with our model, is we don't ask the district for anything. So what we're selling them is the value proposition of the use of our technology. We made a bet early on that we could never scale to the level of revenue that we wanted to be at by selling directly to school boards, by being in the middle of a West Des Moines, Iowa school board and singing for your supper everywhere across the company. That was not going to be scalable. We thought that getting the private sector involved, creating these private label programs for them was the better way to do it. And that's proven to be successful. I don't have a secret sauce for how to sell directly to districts. The only thing I'd probably tell fellow EdTech entrepreneurs is if there are issues you can tackle perhaps at a state or provincial level where there's some funding for scaled size contracts, that might be the way to go. But it's really never been a direction we've gone other than to sell the value of our learning platform. So
I got to imagine if I'm a superintendent and you say, hey, I've got a great piece of your curriculum that's been really successful and the price is $0, you probably have that administrator's attention. So
absolutely.
But you also, there's got to be a feedback loop where these students who are using it, administrators are helping you improve your product. Can you talk about how you've evolved the product over time?
So absolutely. And from the very beginning, one of the core pieces of our value proposition was our ability to measure the impact of our learning platform. So I've always been maniacal about understanding, first of all, making a bet back to our sponsors, those BB&Ts of the world, and saying, we are going to measure how many students use the program, how long they spend on it, how much they learn, how their attitudes and behaviors change as a result of the interface with it. We're going to measure that, and we're going to report that back to you every year. And you can hold us accountable. If we hit our goals, you keep going. If we don't, you can hold us accountable and fire us. Okay. So that measurability has been helpful for the sponsor. But to your question, Joe, it's also very helpful to the school administrator. It's very helpful to them understand how does their student population think about financial literacy or entrepreneurship.
What are the things that you're measuring? What are those goals or metrics?
So there are basically two dimensions. One is a knowledge-based goal. So, around financial literacy or any other topic, we want to understand, does the student know more coming out than they knew coming in, right?
Okay.
The second dimension is how do we influence their behavior? So we think about something like STEM careers with the National Hockey League and other partners that focus on that. Are we getting kids more excited about potentially becoming a data scientist that they might otherwise not have even known as existed as a career?
And your platform is able to measure that with all the users that are using the
so
platform?
as they're going through the learning experience, they're intimately answering questions that are kind of reflection-based questions that can capture that attitude and behavior.
And so clearly you're very knowledgeable in selling into the K-12 sector, but you mentioned other verticals.
Yes.
So I know you've expanded into corporate and executive ed. Can you talk about in the company, one, what the products are there, but even more importantly, how you as a company decided to add on other verticals and get up to speed on selling in a totally different way?
Well, it's a great question. So I think it started when we did our Series A raise in 2010. One of our main use of proceeds of that round was to acquire an existing business that was operating in higher ed. And they were delivering an alcohol education course to first-year students across probably several hundred, U.S.-based campuses. But we saw a very similar kind of mission and ethos fit to what they were doing. They were based in Boston. They were called Outside the Classroom. And they were a great organization. We thought, they could be a really interesting way for us to understand the higher ed market. Because it had the same sort of feel as financial literacy. You had a requirement, typically a mandate of the campus to teach these types of skills. It was done, typically for all first-year students. So by making that acquisition and entering into higher ed, we understood that there were a lot of higher ed-based topic areas that were similar to financial education. The economic model was a little different, though, because Outside the Classroom and since EverFi has always had, in the case of higher ed, been able to license directly to the colleges. Issues like alcohol responsibility and more importantly today, issues like sexual assault prevention are obviously required. They're Title IX requirements in higher ed, but they're really, there's budget and there's mandate to put forth towards those types of learning experiences for students and now for faculty and beyond.
It's like concern number one of every college president.
Absolutely.
Right now.
So we created a slightly different economic model, but it had the same, again, kind of regulatory pressure, helping, a student and kind of faculty administrative population deal with a tough issue. And we were able to do that starting in 2011 when we completed that acquisition. And I'm proud to say, through a couple of other subsequent acquisitions, we're now in almost 2,000 higher ed universities. We are the number one player in that space around alcohol responsibility, sexual assault prevention, both for students and faculty. And then what's interesting about that is in a couple of those follow-on acquisitions that have happened over the last 2 years, we ended up acquiring two of our bigger competitors in higher ed who also were doing corporate education. So they were doing the same type of compliance for employers.
And this is all private label, right? So if I go into a university, it's going to look like it's coming from the university, But what does that do to your company in terms of branding and awareness? I mean, you're the company that's all over the place, but nobody knows about.
Yeah. Well, it's a...
until they listen to this podcast.
Right, yeah, exactly. Well, we can get to our fundraising and things like that, but that certainly put us on the map a bit. But it's actually a label we welcome. We've said from the very beginning, you could read articles about us back in 2009. We want to push credit out to the edges, make this all about our partners, whether they're a bank like BB&T or a university like Maryland. We want to give them the credit for doing this, and we're okay. We always use the metaphor. We're okay being the Intel chip inside. We don't need to be the Dell.
Because that's
the
part
Apple.
of your value proposition to you. They don't have to share the credit with you. They're going to take the credit.
Absolutely.
Got it.
But so when I teach my IT class, I do kind of talk about the Chris Anderson book about free and giving stuff away.
Yeah.
Have you considered or have you tried kind of that, give something away for everybody and take a look at where the customers are and potentially then say, hey, look, University of Maryland, you've got thousands of subscribers that are using our service. What about going ahead and entering into a partnership here?
Well, we did that actually we deployed that as a tactic a few years ago as we saw the requirements around Title IX really being strengthened around sexual assault prevention. One of the things that had happened when we originally built our higher ed course, sexual assault prevention was sort of like within our alcohol. It was a piece within the alcohol education experience. And we said, you know what? First of all, Title IX and compliance aside, it needs to be a bigger piece. I mean, this is too important, too unfortunate an issue. And so what we did is we created its own course. We gave it its own content. And then we actually gave it away for a period of time. We told schools, use this for a year. You don't have to, we won't charge you anything. It really angered the company we ended up acquiring because they thought it was a kind of a race to the bottom. But what it did was it proved that our curriculum could add some value, could give the campus a necessary tool to meet a new requirement. And they ended up eventually becoming, a lion's share of them becoming paying customers after that kind of trial experience.
Success or failure?
It was a success.
Success,
yeah,
okay.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's really the only time we've ever, kind of experimented with that type of tactic like you described. So, but definitely a success. So.
And so, since the title of our podcast is Bootstrapped, we talk a lot about funding strategies for companies.
Sure.
EverFi had a very big, I think, $190 million round
correct.
within the last 12 months.
Yep.
Very visible. You kind of alluded to that.
Yeah.
Certainly, that certainly raised the visibility. Can you talk a little bit about that round and what I think for our listeners to understand, like there's a lot of our listeners are thinking, I'm trying to raise $250,000 and convince angels or venture capitalists to give me those kind of dollars. What do you do to pitch raising $190 million?
By saying congratulations?
Congratulations.
$190 million.
Right.
Now, we don't have to count out how many zeros are after that.
That's
90,
right.
That's a lot of. That's
you're right.
Congratulations.
Yes. First of all, congratulations. Now answer my question.
No, it's all right. So it's interesting.
Where was the company at that point, and what were you looking to, and what was
in new venture finance was absolutely, by the way, my favorite course at Smith.
Did you take it with Mark Robick? Can you give him a shout out?
No, actually, since retired Bob Baum.
Bob Baum. We were literally just talking about Bob Baum like
Bob
minutes
Baum.
ago.
Love that guy.
I love him as well.
Yes, we'll dedicate this episode to Bob Baum.
You should. We will. I want you to,
Holly, yes, we will. We promise.
He was truly my entrepreneurial inspiration. He knows that. And so, the new venture finance is a process. You both know this, but I think one of the threads in the process from when you bootstrap to your Series A to your $190 million round, like we just did our Series D, is the common thread is you're selling stock in your company. So whether you think that stock's worth $250,000 or collectively $190 million investment, you're selling the value of your stock. And so that was always really important to us, and I think a great lesson. And my partner, Tom, came from venture capital, so he sat at the other side of the table, and I've just learned so much from his perspective on that, from now being on our side of the table versus the other side of the table, is when you're raising that first round, you can't be desperate and say, we really need this money, we're burning, we're going to go out of business. You got to believe that, we've got something valuable. Mm-hmm. You're purchasing shares in my business, in our company. And so whether, again, that's $250,000, $190 million, it's all an evolution. And we went into it at every round knowing the types of investors we wanted. We always went after kind of top-tier investors, not that everyone doesn't want to, but we were fortunate enough to convince them of what we were doing. We started here locally in New Enterprise Associates up in Chevy Chase. They kind of led our our A venture round in 2010, the one we used to acquire that higher ed business. And then as we kind of moved along, we got lucky with other individuals. So Jeff Bezos led our Series B round with his personal investment vehicle, Bezos Expeditions, not affiliated with Amazon, what he used basically to buy the Post. And then at every stage after that, we finally got to the point last year where most companies of our size, you're kind of considering the private equity route. You've started to get big enough where your valuation can warrant a private equity size check. For us, though, what was really unique and what we're super excited about going forward is we didn't just take traditional private equity investment. We were a recipient of a special kind of vehicle out of TPG's growth fund called the Rise Fund. It's a social impact investing vehicle and obviously designed to support businesses like ours. And what's interesting today is there's just not a lot of quality inventory for those, for the proliferation of a number of those funds to go out and invest. And I think especially ones that had scaled to our size, to our level of impact. And so it was a perfect combination for us and because it was a social impact fund, it never felt too intimidating because we were really proud of the business we had built and the impact we were having. And we knew that we were the type of businesses that these funds were created for. And so I think it gave us a little bit of a unique kind of confidence. And I know that doesn't really necessarily maybe resonate with all of your listeners or others that come through Smith because they may not be, creating companies that can be a recipient of a social impact investment vehicle. But for us, that was a big part of it. And so it made the number and the size of the round a little less intimidating. Again, we just knew we were selling the value of our company and we were doing so to have an impact. And
just for our listeners, just so you're clear, you're talking about, series of funding and they're labeled A, B, C. Yep. So you're D. And frankly, we don't often get to talk to entrepreneurs who have gone through that many rounds. Yep. And it sounds like by the time you got to D, you kind of knew your audience a lot. Yeah. But which round was the hardest? I've always wanted to find out. Was it A, B, C, or D? It's like a multiple choice exam.
Right. It's definitely A or B.
Really? Okay. So this makes our listeners happier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. It's easier.
So the dollar amount goes up, but it becomes easier.
Well, you understand the fundamentals of your business better, right? You understand what it takes to grow, what your risk factors are. You got more reps under your belt. So. Like my unfortunate Patriots who lost, they've been to the Super Bowl 8 times. It's easy when you've been there 8 times to not let things affect you. So yeah, A and B is hard. I mean, A is hard because you're trying to really prove you got a scalable concept, but yet you're still really small. B is tricky too, because once you've gotten over that, you sort of go through, some awkward teenage adolescent phases of scaling and growing your business. So I'd say those two are definitely the more challenging.
And how important was it to get somebody like your partners really for A and B? Yeah. I'm sorry, what's the name of the firm in Chevy Chase?
New Enterprise Associates.
Right, and then you had Bezos. Too.
Yeah. I mean those were always and in between we'd always made a very concerted effort to create individual investors, even if they had smaller stakes, and those lead folks. Behind us. So we were able to collect, folks like Evan Williams, one of the co-founders of Twitter, Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google and his venture fund. These were
pretty good list.
These were kind of folks that we wanted involved in what we're doing, as well as others that are lesser known, but guys up in New York, Rethink Education, that's done a lot of great education investments and have been a fantastic partner of ours. We had them as well. So we always wanted to create folks that we felt gave us strength, not just in terms of we knew at the end of the day they were just giving us capital to help us grow our business, and you never want to expect anything more than that. But certainly the strength of those, that association was a powerful thing for us.
And so, we know when you raise that kind of money, any amount of it, there's expectations of your, investors and what growth looks like and what the next steps are. So, what next do you guys, see yourself as an IPO prospect? Is there, my sense would be like not building this to necessarily sell it yet, but what do you think is going to happen?
We're still having a lot of fun, which is good.
Yeah.
My two co-founders, Tom and Ray, as well as the many other talented folks on our executive team, are ones who we're really tight and I think have a really good rhythm. So yeah, we're not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere anytime soon. I think there's probably two outcomes. I think, there's an IPO. That's obviously at our company stage. That's one of the potential outcomes. And we have great, sort of models like 2U's. We're really close to Chip and his team in that business, and watching them kind of go public and really succeed as a public company. That's one option. Or I kind of alluded to before, you see this proliferation of social impact funds, and there may be possibilities where we could get one of those involved as we continue to grow. And certainly any private equity investor wants to, that's a natural, kind of occurrence as they, invest at one stage and may turn it over to another fund. So I think that's probably another potential option, but who knows? We're still,
and you're having fun. That's
yes,
what's important.
Yes.
So last question for you, Jon, is to think about, we have, as Joe mentioned, a lot of our listeners are either in startups, want to be, thinking about launching something. And are in that where like everything seems so hard, every part of the business. You can't look anywhere where you say, oh, that's the easy thing that I'm going to do today.
Right.
But as you look back to get, what advice could you pass along, for those entrepreneurs who look at where EverFi is like, oh, if we could only be where that is, like, what do you think were some of the key decisions that you made in those really hard times that helped you get where you are today?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. Number one, I mentioned this earlier in our conversation. Go after revenue. Figure out what your model is. Whatever it is. Ours is unique. It doesn't have to be exactly like ours, but figure out what that is and stay focused on it. It doesn't mean you can't be focused on your product or other pieces of the business, but really understand your economic model and what's going to, help you reach the pro forma you've created, and just stay maniacally focused on that. Hold your team accountable to that. That's number one. Number two, and this is a little more fluffy, but at the end of the day, it's true, is you have to always believe that you're going to get to where you're going to get. You have to walk around. When we talked about our network back in the day, I used to, joke with Tom, our co-founder. He'd always talk about sort of, our school network. If we were in like 5 schools in a district, we'd sort of like assume that we were going to be in the rest of the 15. So we'd sort of say, oh yeah, we're in 20 and we're in 1,000 when maybe we were starting to move there, right? But you got to kind of sort of like have a little bit of swagger and belief that you're bigger than you are.
You're a Patriots fan, right?
That's right. Okay. That's right. And so
Got it.
that is, I've got a little bit of Massachusetts bravado to me. That's where I grew up. And, I think that's got to be, you got to take that into the room, whether you're meeting with a superintendent, whether you're meeting with a dean of student affairs, whether you're meeting with a CEO of, American Express. It doesn't matter. You have to, show that what you're creating is going to be something really special and really unique, and let that shine through. If that happens, whatever you're in, you will succeed and you'll get there. But that's a big piece as well.
Well, Jon, that's great advice. Thank you so much for being in studio today, and we're excited to watch where things go over the next couple of years.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I thought, hearing from Jon really delivered on what I had hoped to in this interview, because I think that the way they have developed a very unique business model, and he also can articulate both sides, how he's getting a job done for both sides, specifically a very acute pain point for the banks that when most people look at their business model, they probably don't understand. So recognizing that there was a way to pair these two, the need for this kind of education in the classroom, and then all the way over here, a very separate customer for them, and be able to match them together to create this really incredible platform is just really impressive.
How many times, Alana, do you and I sit down with startups, with founders, with students and say, fall in love with the problem? And absolutely. The whole story of EverFi is, here's a problem that was presented. We have a financial crisis. We have to go ahead and ask these banks to go ahead and provide some financial literacy. Banks don't know, or they're certainly not in their DNA to be all about education. And so, he's taking his background from Kaplan, recognizing that there's a way to go ahead about this that's much more scalable. It's going to be engaging to the students through gamification. It's just a great story. And then, of course, to the theme of course, our podcast about Bootstrapped, the idea of saying, look, I know there isn't a very healthy capital market out there, so we're going to go ahead and bootstrap this, get the revenue, do as much as we can to go ahead and scale it out. The white labeling or the private labeling to go ahead and make sure that you can do it, fantastic.
And I think that also whenever you do whenever you do an analysis of what was happening at the time when a startup was able to really get traction and put all the pieces together, EverFi is just a perfect example of what was happening at that time. So because of the financial crisis, because of, as he mentioned, No Child Left Behind, Common Core,
That's right.
the
That's
evolution, things changing in the regulatory environment in both places, and like you mentioned, the team that they had put together was a really unique combination at the time, and gamification, it being a new thing from a perspective of EdTech, not just video games. And so pulling that all together at a very unique time, you kicked off the episode saying like, wow, 2008, what a crazy time to start a company. Well, you know what? It was the exact right time to start this company.
Yeah, I mean, how many times is time? It's like the right idea, even the right people, but the wrong time. And I think everything kind of aligned for them back in 2008.
And I think, my interest in watching kind of their funding pattern, is really interesting to hear him talk about the people that he brought in as funders along the way, and all the different. We talk about with entrepreneurs all the time, and even students, anyone kind of putting a brand together, whether it's your personal brand or your company. Where do you allocate your time to make sure that you have certain credentials and check the box in certain places? And I think they did a really good job of that by bringing on BB&T. They didn't they found a brand name bank. They knew they needed a brand name to go with. They went and found brand name investors and sold their case to that when they could have taken other capital, and then let it all come together.
And not just the way in which they're working with the banks, the way they're working with the people who are helping fund them. I mean, they recognize there's partners. And, yes, it is much more difficult in Series A and B to go ahead and raise the financing, but to be, to vet your partners, to be very selective, to understand, to have the patience. How many times have you worked with entrepreneurs who are saying, I need to move quickly before somebody, copies my idea? And it takes a real kind of patience for an entrepreneur to go ahead and wait and say, no, we're going to make sure we do this the right way. So we should have asked Jon, how many times did he pass on other banks that might have wanted to do this before finally saying, no, this is the right fit?
Well, I think that wraps up a great episode of Bootstrapped. We promised Jon that we'd dedicate this episode to Bob Baum, one of our all-time favorite professors at the Smith School. So once again, thank you for listening to Bootstrapped, a Dingman Center podcast. I'm Ilana Fine. You can follow me at Ilana Fine or through the Dingman Center at UMD_Dingman.
And I'm Joe Bailey. You can follow me on Twitter at Joseph P. Bailey. And for all of our listeners, I know I close out the episode encouraging you to bootstrap your next venture. We actually invite you to go ahead and bootstrap today so that when you're talking about your Series D 10 years from now, you can go ahead and be a guest on Bootstrap. So please do bootstrap your next venture. Thanks for listening.